Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 585 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Philip Gelatt. He's the writer and director of the horror films The Bleeding House and They Remain, and he's also been a writer for TV shows such as Love, Death, and Robots, and video games such as Rise of the Tomb Raider. And in this interview, we'll be discussing his work on the science fiction film The Europa Report, and the animated sword and sorcery film The Spine of Night. And now here's our interview with Philip Gelatt. All right, so we're here with Philip Gelatt. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I understand that you weren't allowed to watch The Black Cauldron as a kid. So tell us about
that. What a great question. Oh, wow. So yeah, I notoriously in my family, and now I guess beyond my family, when I was young, I must have been, what year did Black Cauldron come out? 85, 86, something like that. I really wanted to see it, desperately wanted to see it, but it was rated PG. And my mom, although she blames it on my grandmother, told me that I couldn't see it because it was rated PG. And so I was taken instead to see Sesame Street's Follow That Bird. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but I remember it being a great film. Don't get me wrong. As a kid, I was like, oh, this is great. But The Black Cauldron stuck in the back of my mind as this forbidden thing that I had been prevented from seeing, obviously, when I was a kid. And it led to a lot of interest. So then when I was only a few years older, I discovered that The Black Cauldron was, of course, based on a book. So then I read The Black Cauldron as a book first, and then read that whole series by Lloyd Alexander, and that sort of, really probably ultimately gave birth to my interest in fantasy and dark fantasy more broadly. Like a little bit of a tangent. I was a Tolkien kid as a kid, but more than that, I was a Lloyd Alexander kid. Like I loved those Prydain novels, probably even more than I loved, the Tolkien stuff. So there you go. Don't prevent your kids from seeing PG-rated fantasy films, or they might turn into freaks. I don't know what to tell you.
Is that kind of your origin story, or do you think you would have turned out the same even if your mom had let you go see Black Cauldron?
I jokingly think it's my origin story. I think I probably would have turned. I mean, I can point to like other darker origin story moments if you want, but they all sort of coalesce. I mean, like I'm like so many people I think that get into writing and film and video games, whatever. Like I'm a screen kid, a child of divorce. Like there's all kinds of things contribute to what makes a person. But the Black Cauldron moment is before any of that. It's like, 5-year-old young innocent Phil being like, ooh, I want to see those skeleton creatures. And my mom being like, no. So yeah, it's definitely in there. It's part of the DNA for sure.
I don't know if you've heard this story, but when they screened the original cut of the Cauldron-born sequence, they screened it for a bunch of kids, and the kids all screamed and ran out of the room. They were so scared.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say I applaud them, but I'm not sure who them is in that sentence. Maybe I don't applaud anybody in that. I applaud the people that made the sequence and were like, hey, let's put this in a Disney film. I mean, it's a weird, the whole production history of that movie is pretty fascinating, in that it's, it sort of, it from that is birthed, what are commonly heralded as the Disney classics, like, or some of the Disney, like the Little Mermaid and et cetera. But I don't know. To me, The Black Cauldron that's where it's at. Even though between you and me, it's not that great a movie, but there are things in it that are absolutely amazing, and that Cauldron-born sequence is one of them for sure.
Well, when you say it led to The Little Mermaid and Aladdin and stuff, it's because it was such a catastrophe that they completely changed their whole approach and it's when I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name.
The guy that sort of oversaw those animated features, he had come in the middle of Black Cauldron, and my understanding is that he took a lot of the lessons, saw what was going so horribly wrong on Black Cauldron, and sort of got in front of those problems. It's one of those. It's I can't remember his name. One of those famous Disney people. A real Disney person would know who I'm talking about. I'm not one of those people, so I can't remember his name. So
yeah. So you got into the Lloyd Alexander books, and then you must have gotten into more like horror kind of stuff from there, right? So what was that kind of trajectory like?
Yeah. So I it's an interesting thing looking back, honestly, because I love horror now, but as a kid, and I really wanted to see the Black Cauldron, but I was really, really scared of horror movies as a kid, like really, really scared of them. So I remember being going to a sleepover where friends had rented the Ghoulies. Remember the Ghoulies? There's like a Ghoulie and a toilet on the cover. It's like a knockoff Gremlins, and
I actually never saw it, but I would see the box, on the VHS in the video store, and it traumatized. I often say that I think my childhood would have been twice as happy if I had never seen the Ghoulies box.
So I'm going to tell you this: if you had gone ahead and seen the Ghoulies, you probably wouldn't have no longer have been scared of the Ghoulies, because it's no good. But my friends rented it, and I was the only kid who was too chicken to actually watch the Ghoulies. So but it's that similar sort of thing, like with horror, the push and pull of the desire to see a thing you're not supposed to see. Like it was definitely there in me in the Black Cauldron, and then you get to this weird Ghoulies example where it's like, oh, there it is in front of me, but I'm too afraid to actually watch it. And then I didn't get really into horror until probably I was in high school, and at that point I had seen Alien, which was it's still a huge movie for me, Alien, and I started reading. I was always reading a lot, but started specifically reading a lot of horror. So I remember reading Clive Barker for the first time. I remember. I don't know how salty we want this podcast to get. I remember
maximum salty.
Maximum salty. I remember getting into Stephen King and then very quickly getting out of Stephen King, because I was like, I don't know if this guy knows how to end a book, even at whatever age I was, 13, thinking, I think I can find something more my speed. So Clive Barker, Anne Rice was huge for me at the time, and then also like other fantasy writers as well. And so I grew up in small town Wisconsin. So like a town I don't think it's gotten much bigger since I lived there. So it's about 50,000 people. So not tiny, but not a big place. So I think a lot back on like, how did I learn about H.P. Lovecraft? Like Lovecraft was huge for me, probably when I was starting when I was a freshman in high school. And like, I don't even know. My recollection is that I saw Evil Dead 2, but why I would have seen it, I don't know. I rented it, and in it, of course, there's a Necronomicon Ex Mortis, and then at some point, I was in a Barnes and Noble and saw the back of a Lovecraft book, and it mentioned the Necronomicon on the back of the Lovecraft book, and I was like, oh, that's like Evil Dead. I'm going to read this book, or whatever those connections are. That sort of triggered for me,
Well, I saw in an interview, I saw you said, I don't know if I could work on a romantic comedy and not have it be somehow inspired by Lovecraft.
Yes.
So that obviously made a big impression on you.
Yeah, I mean, he's a what's the gentle way of saying it? He's a problematic figure these days. I've come to call, one inevitably gets inspired by a lot of people who are eventually problematic. So I've come to refer them as my problematic masters, and Lovecraft is certainly one of them. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that's just in the DNA of everything I work on. At a certain point, you can just, I don't know, like in the creative process, you're like, oh, how's this beat going to go? How's this beat going to go? And I can always feel this sort of like, there's always just a little bit of Lovecraft in there thinking, oh, what would that weird old racist say about this beat? How would he handle it?
Well, I just think he's so important because this is a gross generalization, but before Lovecraft, horror was basically about good, supernatural good versus supernatural evil. Yep. And Lovecraft is like, there's no supernatural good. It's just, materialism and supernatural evil is all you're going to get.
And I'm also like a salty enough nerd to be sort of annoyed by like the plushification of Cthulhu, which I just think is like, I get it and I appreciate it, I suppose, but the core of the appeal to me is really sort of the like bleak acknowledgement of mankind's place in the cosmos, really, that this sort of like staring into the abyss of our own, like insignificance, really. And like that to me is that's the horror of Cthulhu ultimately, or all those stories, you know?
My wife and I have a 4-month-old daughter, and so I've been looking at all these children's books, and one I just came across, it's called C is for Cthulhu.
I have that book.
So,
I have that book.
Oh, yeah.
It's great. Yeah. Like I say, I stand both with the plushification of Cthulhu, but also against it. I'm in a very ambivalent place.
Mm-hmm. But I've listened to a bunch of interviews with you, and I was really impressed by, you mentioned reading authors like M. John Harrison, Steph Swainston, and K.J. Bishop. These aren't the standard author, fantasy and science fiction authors that everybody mentions when I interview them.
Yep. So I love all three of those authors. I mean, I don't even know what to say about them. I would say M. John Harrison is, to my later life, probably as inspirational as Lovecraft, if not more. I mean, I've never met him. I hope to one day, but I've started to think that he sort of ruined me because I can't. I don't know if you read his blog or any of his like writing, but he
seems kind of grouchy. Is the impression? I haven't read his blog, but
he's grouchy, but he's also like intensely thoughtful about genre in general, and the way that I'm not nearly as articulate or intelligent as he is, but there's just a way in which he engages with sort of narrative fiction in general, both in his own writing and his own writing about writing. And I can't not like feel my version of his voice in my head, if you can follow that train of thought as I'm reading things. I mean, he has some really, really salty, I'll find them and send them to you. I can find them blog posts where he's actively pushing against the way that stories get written in Hollywood, basically. And by that, I specifically mean against the idea of the hero's journey and against the idea of Joseph Campbell as this sort of, guiding narrative post, like, whatever you want to call it, guiding, structure through which you tell a story. And just, he's clearly so dedicated to making each story do the specific thing that it is supposed to do without necessarily 100% fitting into a genre. But then also, like, he constantly writes within genre himself. So he just has this way of, it's like sort of being infected by genre, but also infecting genre with his own sort of personal perspective. Anyway, I think he's like the greatest. I just love him. And so I discovered those other authors you named. I mean, I discovered KJ Bishop, and I think maybe Steph Swainston as well, via M. John Harrison. And I discovered Harrison via reading China Mayville. And if you want to follow one more back, I discovered China Mayville because I was really into Ursula Le Guin when I was younger. And then sometime in my 20s, I was like, I wonder what Ursula Le Guin has been up to. And I read an interview with her where she mentioned China Mayville. So this is the whole astrology that gets you to those authors.
And I definitely want to get into the Hollywood stuff, but I was curious to ask you, my wife does a horror podcast, and so she's had this book floating around our house called In the Dust of This Planet by Eugene Thacker.
Yep. And
you guys were talking about it on one of the interviews I watched. I was just curious. Sounds like it's sort of dense, or
Yeah, it is dense, and it's the sort of what do you want to call it? The anti-natalist, the sort of anti-human life perspective of Lovecraft pushed. I don't want to say as far as it can go, but like it sort of has built it out into an overarching philosophy, both of horror and existence, sort of via, I don't know if you know Thomas Ligotti's work, but my recollection of that book is it's Lovecraft into Ligotti, and then into this sort of, really, I mean, it's honestly probably more nihilistic than I am about, about things, but I don't know if I would read it when I have when you say a 4-month or a 4-year-old. I probably would wait a little while before reading it, maybe if you're thinking about picking it up, because it's pretty intense.
Yeah, and I have a Thomas Ligotti book called My Work Is Not Yet Done that it's sort of on my list to read. It's sort of like Lovecraft goes to work. Basically, it's like Office Space meets Lovecraft or something.
Yes.
Is the impression I get.
Yes. And I mean, Ligotti's his whole thing is I mean, I'm just going to repeat what I said. His view on existence is sort of more nihilistic than Lovecraft's, and more sort of hopeless about the nature of mankind. And that book in particular sort of fits that into into the workplace. He's got other collections that sort of examine this from different perspective, but he's like, if, to use a heavy metal metaphor, if Lovecraft is like early Metallica, then Ligotti is like Norwegian black metal, if that means anything to you. It's like, it's sort of the pushed farther and darker. So
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So you like the really like dark views. You like the guys with the really dark views, but you would sort of orient yourself a little, like, not so far in that direction.
Yes. I don't know that I really have an overarching philosophy of existence, not to get super deep, but I tend to feel myself drawn towards people with really sort of dark perspectives on things, even though as I'm sure you can tell, we just met, but I'm a pretty affable guy. But I don't know if I'm drawn. I don't know that I necessarily agree with them. I don't know that I necessarily disagree with them, but I know that I like to engage with them sort of intellectually and emotionally, and however else you want to term that. So yeah, I am drawn to them. I mean, like, I don't think M. John Harrison has a nihilistic view of humanity, for example. So I like to read widely and broadly, but I would, like, with the rom-coms, like, you're probably not going to find me reading Chicken Soup for the Soul or those sorts of things. It's just not my bag. So yeah.
Okay, so I love Europa Report. I saw it years ago. I didn't realize until recently that you wrote it.
Yeah.
So just tell us about that. How did that come about?
So Europa Report started basically in a very Hollywood way, which is interesting because it's not a particularly Hollywoody movie. It started, I had a meeting with a producer who basically said, hey, I think we could make a found footage science fiction film pretty cheaply. That would be 3 sets, a surface of a planet, a spaceship, and maybe a little bit of ground control. What would you, and maybe it would be about a journey to a planet. What would you do with that? And so I scurried away thinking, oh, this is exciting because I love science fiction, and wouldn't it be fun to come up with something that could be made? And so that's really the genesis point of it. I mean, I tend to whenever I'm going into like a genre project, to try to think about things I haven't seen the genre do in a while. So at that moment, I was thinking about found footage, but I was also thinking about how we hadn't really seen hard sci-fi on screen in a while. And honestly, it's super, super rare in general, hard sci-fi on screen. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to try to do that, to try to make it a journey out into space to a planet to find an alien life, but really grounded all in plausible science to the best of our ability. I think at one point I pitched it like 2001 without the psychedelia, which, when I say it, sounds really boring, but I think the movie turned out pretty good, pretty well. But I like the psychedelic parts of 2001 is, I guess, what I mean. So that's sort of how it started. And from there, then it was like, okay, a lot of the creative decisions were based on, okay, what are the plausible places that mankind could physically get to? Which of those could plausibly have some form of life on it? How would that mission get constructed? What types of things might happen on that mission? And it all sort of grew out of that.
Right. And you're definitely right that that hard science fiction is really sparse in Hollywood. So I'm just curious, like, when you pitched that idea, were people receptive to it, or like, why is there so little hard science fiction?
Man. So the producers on the project were amenable to the idea, but I think they were amenable to it, to be honest, because it should have blended so well with the idea of found footage, because the whole found footage subgenre is sort of predicated on an increased believability, right? Because you're only seeing it through the cameras that exist, in the fictive space, right? So they hypothetically go hand in hand. It should. So my whole pitch was like, oh, it should feel like a documentary about a journey that hasn't happened. And so they were pretty on board. As to why it's not more prevalent in Hollywood, my cynical answer is because of Star Wars. And by that I mean, at this point, when you think about science fiction in Hollywood, you're thinking about really, space opera, or you're thinking about big splashy stuff. You're basically thinking about Star Wars, and the reason you're thinking about Star Wars is because it's so prevalent in the pop culture, in the Uber culture, in the economic culture of Hollywood. It's still huge. So part of the reason I think that you're not seeing more hard sci-fi is because there's no huge financial success to point to where it's like, oh, people want grounded science fiction stories. So I think that's really honestly the big reason. And also, to say it, it's hard to make any movie. It's hard to make space opera. It was hard to make Star Wars. It's also really hard to make hard sci-fi because it requires a lot of research, and it requires a sort of, call it like intellectual rigor on top of the creative rigor, on top of all the other things that go into making a film,
So how much time did you spend on research for it?
Probably, I mean, I never really stopped researching it throughout the course of the making of it. I mean, I'm sure you will know if you go back and watch it, there are things in there that aren't scientifically accurate. There's a line that was added at some point in post that drives me crazy, where they land, and I'm pretty sure a scientist says off screen, that's how I know they added it late in the process, I'm pretty sure they say that the temperature on the moon's surface is absolute zero, which is of course absolute bullshit. Like that's not it's not absolute zero. There's one other line in there I think that I'm like, oh, I did not write that line and I wouldn't have let it get past. Anyway, I think before I put pen to paper, I researched probably about, I would say, half a year to 8 months probably. And that was, that research was, that went hand in hand with like writing the treatment of the, like, sort of getting the story beats in place, because the science was affecting the story beats. Right. So, and that research was, both, space travel research, and it was also, like, for lack of a better term, like planetary science research. Like what did scientists think Europa was like at that point? What might it have been like? So I read like I got both the layman's version of the big text on Europa at the time, which was like a book length. And then I don't think I still have it. This enormous, I mean, I didn't read it all the way through. It was like 1,000 pages of like, speculation on, what do they call it? Tidal heating and all, sub crust heating, all this stuff. So,
did you have any sort of scientific backgrounds at all, or was it just, you're just winging it?
No, I was definitely winging it. No, I mean, I the only scientific background I had was being a lover of science fiction and a lover of Arthur C. Clarke and, people who had done it before. So, and I figured that, that the information that I needed was probably pretty available. And I mean, it was. There have been a lot of really great books written on space travel and not so many great books written on Europa, like Europa Science at the time. But also, I should point out, apologies to the Arthur C. Clarke estate. I mean, that's 2010 is all about going to Europa, and and it's sort of like, again, like sort of like Europa Report, but with a different ending. So I went back and I read that again. I read a lot of like Kim Stanley Robinson. I read all of like the Mars trilogy, which isn't really research, but it's more just like thinking about how other people who have written hard sci-fi have handled it, to try to just get my my mind around how the genre works if you're doing it that way.
Did you know any science fiction writers or scientists that you could consult with at all, or you're just doing it all on your own?
So at the beginning it was on my own, and then once it started to become clearer that there was going to be money behind the movie, then I think. Well, then there were like real science advisors, right? So we had. I think before I did the first draft of the script, I had a couple of conversations with these guys at JPL who were there, not the lead Europa people, but the just under them Europa people were very forthcoming with their time. So I talked to them a lot, and then later in the process, they had like NASA people come in and read the script and look at all of the stuff that I had gotten wrong about about space travel, and then you reach this point, which is just two interesting anecdotes. One is, and I'm sure you may have heard me tell this anecdote before. One is, like we want it to be accurate, like 100% accurate, but those scientists, like, they don't know what's under the ocean or what's under the ice of Europa any more than we do, really. So I would push and push and push for answers, and eventually they were like, well, we don't we don't know. We can give you an idea of what it might be. I think specifically what I'm thinking of is I was asking them, like, okay, so you put a drill on the surface of Europa, you start to drill down, like what's the like ice water interface like? Like, let's say you find water, like what happens just before you find water? Like, what's the ice like? Like, what are like these sorts of things that gets into one's mind when one is trying to imagine a thing? And they're like, yeah, we don't know. We can posit it, but we don't know because we haven't been there. And then, the other anecdote is, and I think about this all the time. I don't know if anybody finds it as affecting as I do, but I remember asking one of them, because they spend their whole lives doing this, and I was like, well, does it bother you? You spend your whole, I'm a tourist here. I'm going to write about Europa for a year, a year and a half, and then I'm going to forget everything I ever knew about it. But like, you'd spend your whole life doing this, and you might never know the answers to these questions because we might never get there, where we might never get a probe under the water, or if there even is water. At the time they weren't. I think now we're sure of it. I think at the time we definitely weren't. Like, does it bother you that you might go to your grave, not to be bleak, but you might go to your grave not having these answers? And the guy's answer was like, no, it doesn't bother me at all. Like, I don't even think about it. And I was like, oh, that's kind of awesome. Like, I don't know. That dedication is really impressive to me. So
that's interesting. I thought the anecdote you were going to say was that you asked them, if you could make a one-way trip to Europa and die, would you take that trip?
I think the answer, I don't know if I asked them that, but I don't know if I even needed to. I mean, I think their answers would 100% be yes. Like, I just think they all would. Yeah. I'm pretty sure. I mean, that's certainly the opinion of the characters in the movie. I think pretty clearly they're all so dedicated to the idea of human knowledge that that their own. I mean, they say it in the movie that their lives don't matter ultimately. So
looking back on Europa Report now, like, what do you feel like has been the experience was like, or the legacy, or what sort of responses have you heard from people about it and stuff like that? I
mean, personally, I'm pretty happy with it. Like, I haven't watched it in a long time because I have a really hard time watching things after I'm done with them. But the last time I watched it, I remember thinking, oh, this is pretty close to what I thought I was making. And that felt pretty good. And I think, honestly, to return to the question of like, what's my philosophy of life? I think those astronauts are pretty close to how I think about things, even still, I think. In terms of the general response, I mean, the movie has a pretty strong and vehement cult following. Like, I run into people with some frequency who love it or who remember it very fondly, or occasionally, like, I run into real fans. Like, I was at a Lovecraft convention. I live here in Providence. There's a Lovecraft convention. Oh, sorry, actually, we don't call it a Lovecraft convention anymore. We call it a weird fiction convention. But anyway, I was there. And this guy, he's like a German scientist. I don't know what kind of scientist he was, but he was so excited to meet me. Like, I was a little bit like, oh, right, okay. Like, I had to like switch into Europa Report mode out of like, weird fiction mode or whatever. But so it's very edifying. Like, I mean, clearly it wasn't popular enough of a movie to like reset the paradigm in Hollywood to make hard sci-fi stuff. But it has its fans, and that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a must-watch movie for hard science fiction fans. I mean, like, and again, there's so few examples. Like,
Yes, yeah, yeah,
you got to watch them all
yeah,
if you're into the form.
yeah.
But then the other movie that I really want to talk to you about is called The Spine of Night,
Hmm.
and I just watched it a couple weeks ago. This was kind of fortuitous, but like 4 or 5 years ago, we did a whole series of panels on basically every '80s sword and sorcery movie you've ever heard of, and just I was just a couple weeks ago, I was like, man, I really miss sword and sorcery movies. I wonder if anyone's made one since we did that series of panels. And so I just looked up, sword and sorcery on Wikipedia and found out that there was one called The Spine of Night that came out a few years ago. And so I watched it, and I had, no particular expectations, but I was blown away by it. I thought it was totally awesome. So again, I definitely, everyone, if you have any interest in sword and sorcery whatsoever, you have to watch this movie. It's bananas. It's bonkers.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Phil, tell us, how did this movie Spine of Night, how did it come about?
How did it happen? So it all comes back to the Black Cauldron. So sort of. I mean that jokingly, but not actually, only sort of jokingly. So I had finished with Europa Report, and I'd had a couple of bad experiences in Hollywood, as anybody who works in Hollywood does. Europa Report wasn't one of them, but just sort of things I'd worked on since. And I was thinking to myself, I would really like to make a crazy fantasy film, and not like Tolkien fantasy, but just, as you say, sword and sorcery, like more like Conan, sort of like gritty and strange and surreal and all those things that I love. But I'm never going to be able to make that in Hollywood. Nobody's ever going to let me do that. And then, honestly, fortuitously, I saw a short film online called Exordium, which was made by Morgan Galen King, who is my co-director and co-writer on Spine. And he had animated it himself and just put it up on YouTube or Machinima, which was still a thing at the time. And a friend of mine who knew I was into that sort of stuff sent it to me, and he was like, "Oh, I think you might like this." And I did indeed like it. In fact, I loved it. So I wrote to Morgan and was like, "Hey, I loved your short. Do you want to do more like this? Who are you? Like, let's be friends." Because clearly we share a taste. And so Morgan and I started working together. He was like, "Oh yeah, I'd love to do more of this." He taught himself how to rotoscope animate based on watching behind the scenes footage from Bakshi's Fire and Ice. So he had this own sort of like bespoke, strange rotoscope style. And so we just sort of scrapped it together is a really shorthand way of saying how it worked. We wrote the script together. It's set in the world that was set up in Exordium, but we co-wrote the script, and we can talk more about the narrative structure in a second, but I'll just explain making the movie. And then we shot the whole thing in a warehouse here in Providence, because for rotoscope you shoot live action reference. So we just cast local weirdos, put them in a warehouse with weird wooden swords and cardboard armor, shot the whole thing, cut a live action version of the whole thing, and then it took years and years and years for the animators. We had a really small team of animators, which is how we were able to do it at the relatively low budget level that we did it.
So Morgan says that he spent 7 years all day, every day.
Yep, that is
animating
true.
This movie.
Yep, 7 years all day, every day. Yep, it is his. And then you may have read interviews where he said he would never do it again, but I'm going to tell you, he is now talking about how he wants to do it again. So we'll wait 7 more years, and there might be another one. Just an enormous amount of work, and that's the animator's work, because I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. So that is the artist that we brought on, and Morgan himself absolutely took all that on. And that's, but sorry, to return to Black Cauldron really quick. So Morgan, also an enormous Black Cauldron fan. And in fact, he has pictures of himself when he was 6 or 7 dressed for Halloween as the Skull King because his parents let him see the Black
I
Cauldron.
think you mean the Horned King.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Horned King. Apologies. The Horned King, because his parents let him see the movie, whereas mine did not. So he was able to put the costume together. But yeah, I mean, it's I'm so glad that you like it. It is meant very much as both a love letter to those old sword and sorcery movies, but then also really a legitimate attempt to try to drag them like into the 21st century, like and like do something new and interesting with them. Yeah, but it's I love it. I'm so happy with how it turned out.
Well, so when you say you knew that no one in Hollywood basically would let you make a sword and sorcery movie, it's kind of the same thing with hard science fiction.
Yes.
Like why is there so little? Like why was sword and sorcery so popular in the 80s? And now there's basically none.
Now there's basically none. Yeah. I don't want to answer the same way, but I will. It's because of Star Wars.
Freaking Star Wars, man.
No, I mean, I love Star Wars, but I also hate it. Like it's I've got a lot of ambivalent, difficult, emotional relationships in my life, and that's definitely one of them. But I think, there's a lot of genres. Hard sci-fi isn't one of them, but sword and sorcery fantasy is, where like there was a moment when they were popular enough and it was like economically viable enough for people to be like, oh, we should make more of that. and that is for sword and sorcery, like the early 80s. I think it's probably based on, I guess, the success of Conan the Barbarian, although some of them predate Conan, so I don't really know. And I honestly don't really know why they died off either. Like, it's not like they were replaced by anything. I mean, I've been saying, for years, probably even before Spine of Night I started working on Spine of Night, that it was really strange that at this point, when you think about theatrical fantasy, you're only thinking about, not you personally or me personally, but just broadly speaking, people are just thinking about Tolkien. Like they're thinking, and I don't necessarily mean specifically Lord of the Rings, but they're thinking about those signifiers. They're thinking about dwarves and elves and like high fantasy, like, rings and epic battles with armies and all this stuff. But the genre, like the fantasy genre, is like the science fiction genre, much, much, much more varied than that. There are so many other flavors of it that are out there. I mean, you get a little bit of it in The Witcher, I guess, is a little sword and sorcery, a little bit, but even that, it's not quite if that's even not quite the same flavor. So it's really hard to know, I don't know. I guess I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
Well, there's been stuff on television. I mean, Game of Thrones has a lot of sword and sorcery in it too, but
it does.
Feature films that just kind of seems like it disappeared from.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no Beastmaster. You must have watched Beastmaster, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh hell yeah. Yeah.
I love Beastmaster. I mean, I love all those movies. They're so much fun and they're so strange. That's what I love. Like I like my fantasy to be weird and this isn't a word. I was going to say uncanonized. Like I don't like how Tolkien has a history of Middle Earth. Like I don't want that. Like if I wanted history, I'd go read a history book. Like I want it to be weird and sort of like murky and like mysterious and all those sorts of things. So,
so my observation about Hollywood, you can tell me what you think, is that they'll make a bunch of movies of a particular type that are bad and no one goes to see them because they're bad. And then they don't conclude, oh, nobody saw them because they were bad. They conclude, oh, nobody saw them because of the type of movie they were. So they'll make like 3 sword and sorcery movies that are bad and no one sees them. And they're like, oh, I guess people don't want to see sword and sorcery movies anymore. Whereas they would go see, if one came out and it was good and everyone told their friends how good it was, people would go see it. That they always they always blame the type of movie rather than the quality of the movie.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think I think this dovetails with larger, more economic structural issues in Hollywood, which is that, at this point, theatrically, there aren't a lot of mid-budget range films, right? So I think the logic in Hollywood currently is if you're going to do a big genre film, you almost need to spend $130 million on it or some crazy number. And there's a lot of genres, sword and sorcery being one of them, that shouldn't require that budget level, and nor can they bear, nor can they expect to make that amount of money back on the first go, right? Like it's almost like you think about Pitch Black, right? The Vin Diesel movie, which I personally like quite a bit, but there's a small canvas to that movie. It's a pretty good movie, a pretty fun movie, and like it's interesting. And this doesn't anyway. Like it is a right-sized genre picture for what it is. Then of course they blew it out in the second one and made this like ridiculous thing. But my point is, like, if you could make sword and sorcery films, you could find the right ones that were sort of the right budget and were done well, to your point, and had good word of mouth and could build an audience. Then I think the genre could live. But there just isn't at the moment. There aren't people out there funding movies on that sort of like the appropriate budget level for the genre, unfortunately.
But so that's what's so intriguing to me about Spine of Night, because it sort of looks like you sort of watch and you're like, I could imagine me and my friends making a movie like this if we had 7 years. Yeah. Is that deceptive, or is that promise reasonable? Is the question? Could you and your friends make Spine of Night if you had 7 years? Yeah. Like, say I have no particular Hollywood connections or anything, but I have a lot of time on my hands and a bunch of talented friends. Yep. Could I do a movie like this, or like what kind of Hollywood connections are sort of like the bare minimum that you need to get something like this off the ground? You
could absolutely make Spine of Night with your talented friends in 7 years. 100% you could. I mean, it's sort of how we did it. I mean, there's a little bit of gloss to it because we have some big name actors doing voices, but those actors didn't come on. I mean, they didn't come on when we started, and they didn't come to the warehouse to shoot the live action. They were hired. We hired them on way, way later, like year 5 or 6. And at that point, the movie was far enough along that we didn't have to go to them with a script and like a dream. We could say, like, here's the movie. This is how it looks. This is how it sounds. We just need you to do this voice. Would you come, be a part of this crazy thing? So, I mean, none of the like Hollywoodness that you might detect in Spine was there at the beginning. It's all at the tail end. Did that get put together? So no, I mean, people should go out and make crazy sword and sorcery films. It would be amazing. I would love that. Definitely.
Well, and I understand, since it was during COVID, that all the actors just recorded all their like ADR over Skype or something, right?
Yes, we did. Yep. It was all via Skype. A few of them were in actual sound studios that were open, but I was never there. I was here at this desk right now, and they would, they would zoom me in, which was really weird. Like Lucy Lawless was in a sound studio in New Zealand. So it was like the middle of the night here, her morning. I mean, she's Lucy Lawless. She's amazing. I think she was so much fun to work with, but like the task of directing a person on the other side of the globe remotely via Skype is very strange. Like it was really weird. But she was great. I've never actually met her in person, which is that's a regret of mine. Maybe someday.
I guess that's interesting to me. That are you able to have this successful Hollywood career from Providence, or do you have to like go to LA for?
I go to LA relatively frequently. Well, it depends. I mean, so pre-COVID, I would go to LA, 3 or 4 times a year, probably, depending on what I needed to do there, if I needed to do anything. Then COVID hit, and suddenly everybody was like, oh, there's Zoom and Skype and all these things. So then, since COVID, I've gone less. I think last year there I was there twice. I mean, it's a weird way to make a career. I mean, I'm very lucky to have managed to cobble it together, to be honest. And I've never lived there. I've always been on the East Coast. I don't really know how I managed to do it, to be honest, but it's working out okay. So
yeah, that's cool. I mean, you started to say earlier about the structure of the story. I don't know if you want to circle back to that.
I mean, one of the things that I love most about Spine is this narrative structure that we built into it, which is that, it like the 1982 heavy metal film or other films, it's sort of an anthology film in that it's comprised of a number of shorts. However, all of those shorts take place on the same timeline within the same world. And I just, I mean, not to toot our own horns, I just think that's awesome. Like I'd never really seen a movie that worked that way before. And I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, like with hard sci-fi, like with sword and sorcery, I also think the anthology film structure is a structure that is ripe to be utilized in ways that people haven't been utilizing it. Like normally you see like VHS and it's like, oh, there are 4 short horror films that are sort of linked because they're all maybe found footage or something, but or like heavy metal where you have this Lochnar that doesn't mean anything that connects them. I just think there is fertile creative narrative territory to be mined there. And I think Spine of Night is, I mean, again, not to toot my own horn, I think it's an example of it, but I think there are probably many, many other more interesting things that could be done with that. Call it a subgenre if you want. Anyway, I guess I just want to highlight that because it is a thing that, like, when people react to the movie, some people hate that it's an anthology. Like some people want the movie to just be that first piece about the swamp and they just want that. And I think when it jumps out of that, it jars them and they get mad. And to those people, I say, well, that was the point of it. It was to jar you out of it and to be like, no, look, we're going to tell this bigger story in smaller pieces.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, to those people, I would say, why don't you go watch any other movie ever made? And it won't be an anthology.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, because I love anthology stuff. I love sword and sorcery. I love hard science fiction, all of which are definitely, like, I'm not well served as an audience member, by a lot of what comes out. So, like, yeah, I really feel a lot of affinity with you guys. And it was just so much fun watching you talk and, that you're just passionate about the same stuff I am. And, and are able to get stuff like this done despite all the kind of headwinds, the Hollywood headwinds.
Yes, all it takes is 7 years of. He's got to find one guy, tie him to a desk, and to, like, sit here and draw for 7 years.
Well, it was funny because in one of these interviews, Morgan said, like, I'd like to make more than one other movie before I die. So, like, I can't spend. Well, because he basically, you guys basically animated every frame by hand for this, right? But there must be some way to automate that process. I don't know if that's, not pure enough or something, or, artistic enough, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's you've put your finger on literally on discussions I have with Morgan, sort of on a if not daily basis, probably monthly or weekly basis. That because we want to make another one. We want to make a sequel specifically to Spine. That's even wilder and woollier and stranger. So we're trying to figure out, exactly as Morgan said in the interview, how we do that and not have it be the last movie that he ever makes. I mean, between you and me and everybody else who will listen to this, like we have a pretty killer. It's about a minute worth of, like, teaser animation from a sequel. The problem with it is that it looks incredible. And I say that's a problem because it looks incredible because Morgan took longer animating it than the process that we did in Spine. So we like, it looks great, but we haven't quite cracked the code on how to automate it, but we're working on it. I won't say more about that at the moment, except to say that we're working on it and we have a script that I'm incredibly happy with for a sequel, and we are sort of actively trying to find partners who can help us figure out how to do it in a way that won't literally end Morgan's life, because I don't want that to happen. No movie is worth that. So,
well, no, this movie is awesome. And I definitely, anyone listening to this, if you're looking for, if you have a big pile of money that you need to invest somewhere, this seems like a good opportunity to me.
We're right here.
But it does seem like, the movie has gotten a good response, and it seems like it's opened up different opportunities for you guys in, like, tabletop role-playing games and all sorts of other things. Is that kind of how it feels to you? Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like sort of like Europa a bit, and maybe this is just how say what I'm doomed to be, but that's the wrong word. That's not how I think about it. It's like there are people that
who absolutely like 100% get it and love the hell out of it. And it's amazing to meet those people. Like they're like, it's great. There's all sorts of people with like tattoos, like crazy Spine of Night tattoos. And then one of the most edifying things I have to say is when we were doing the festival circuit, we would watch it, with crowds, and there would be people who would come up and on a number of not a ton of them, but enough of them who would say, "Oh, I'd never really loved a fantasy film before, or like I'd never really loved an animated film before, but like it really, it was a thing that they'd never seen before, and it was 100% for them." And I think that's, I don't know, like I love. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a jumping into a tangent here, but I love subcultures, and I love weird little niches of storytelling and like taste, and to be able to make things that are speaking to people who aren't getting spoken to by sort of the uber mass culture is, I don't know, it's really sort of, I think, ultimately the reason I got into doing this stuff in the first place. So it's very gratifying. Which isn't really your question. Your question was more, did it open up other possibilities for us? Which it has. Actually, I'll say this: the funniest opportunity that it opened up for us, nothing ever came of it, was some French company had the rights to some real like low tier L. Ron Hubbard books, and they were like, "Hey, do you want to come rotoscope animate these L. Ron Hubbard books?" We did not take that opportunity, but I was like, "This is the weirdest thing I've ever been asked to look into." So that was pretty fun.
I mean, one experience I had. So I mentioned I watched this a couple weeks ago, and then I emailed all my friends who are into sword and sorcery and fantasy and stuff, and said, because I wanted to talk about it on the podcast, and I said, like, check out this movie. It's like a animated film in the vein of Ralph Bakshi's Fire and Ice. And I had one friend respond and say, "I hate Ralph Bakshi." And like nobody else responded. And so I felt like maybe I should have had a different sales pitch in retrospect. But people,
people don't love, well, he's such a, I don't know, we don't need to talk about Ralph Bakshi too much. He's a I did not know this. He's a pretty divisive figure. Like there are people who love his stuff, and then there are people who cannot stand it. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you hate Ralph Bakshi, watch this movie anyway. You'll love it.
We're way better than Ralph. If you hate Ralph Bakshi, see The Spine of Night. It's for you. We made it for you.
But I do feel like this is a film that a lot of people like don't know that they would love. It has sort of a like a marketing challenge in that respect.
It absolutely does. I mean, I think it is. It's a marketing challenge in that it's not based on big IP. It's a marketing challenge in that it's an adult animated film, and by adult I don't just mean like the Black Cauldron. I mean it's like fully adult. It's naked and it's gory, and it is, I think, thematically pretty rich, I think. So it's just challenges all over the place, but for the right person you're gonna love the hell out of it.
yeah
I
mean, there are almost no movies in the last 5 years that I've watched more than once, and I've watched this one twice now, and I'm definitely going to watch it again and again.
That's so nice to hear. Thank you so much.
We're almost out of time. Do you want to talk about some of your other projects? I mean, so there's this Veilgrave Kickstarter.
Yep.
There's something called Dungeon Crawl.
I've got too many projects. Let's talk about, Veilgrave real quick. Veilgrave is a I don't know if you know Mork Borg. Mork Borg is a like a rules light version of Dungeons and Dragons, basically set in a sort of grim, dark, black metal world. It's got a great design sense, and a lot of like sort of spin-off books and stuff. So Morgan and I wrote an adventure module for it called Veilgrave. The Kickstarter is done, but you can buy the book from Severed Books, and it's if you've seen The Spine of Night, you'll be unsurprised to hear that it involves a rule set where you can turn your characters into skeleton warriors. It also involves like a strange drug that's being sold in these weird like petrified woods that slows down time for the users, and there's cannibals and other skeletons. There's it's proper sword and sorcery strangeness.
Man, those Disney animators could just never have known how many skeleton warriors they were unleashing on the world.
They had no idea that they were gonna create a whole subgenre of weirdos who love this stuff. Dungeon Crawl, I can't say too much about. Dungeon Crawl is a project that I'm slowly working on with the artist Skinner, who's a heavy metal artist. He did a lot of album covers for like Mastodon and High on Fire, which actually that project is born out of the publicity tour for Spine of Night, because Skinner did an interview with us on Instagram Live, and in that interview the idea for Dungeon Crawl sort of like was created. That's also animated. That's but it like a Spine sequel. It's a tricky one to figure out how to do it. So we're working on it. But the tone of that would be much more, Spine's like got a pretty serious tone to it. Dungeon Crawl is a much more like goofy's the wrong term, but it's lighter and sort of funnier than Spine. I should say, like, you're interviewing me, but I'm releasing a series of like interviews with horror authors, not audio. It's like a documentary series that'll come out in February. So if you like horror writers, there's a whole thing. It's called First Word on Horror, if people want to check it out. And it's interviews with Laird Barron, Paul Tremblay, Mariana Enriquez, Stephen Graham Jones, and Elizabeth Hand. If you know any of those authors, they're all really great.
Oh yeah. I mean, Stephen Graham Jones, and I think Paul Tremblay has been on the show like 7 times or something.
Has he really? That's so funny.
Yeah,
he's great. I love Paul. He's so much fun.
Yeah. Like all those guys. Like I've actually never had Laird on the show. Weirdly, I should do that. But like John Langan and Grady Hendrix. I mean, Grady's been on the show like, I don't even know, 12 times or something.
He is so fun to listen to, Grady. He's he's so charming.
Yeah, he's an old friend of ours from New York.
Nice. That's awesome. I love that.
I've known him since before he was famous. So.
From like even before Paperbacks from Hell. What was that, his first?
Oh yeah, long before that. Yeah, I mean, he just published like a couple of short stories maybe when I first met him.
That's awesome. I love that. You should get Laird on though. He's he's great. I was gonna say before he keels over and dies on us, you should have him on.
I would love. Yeah, if people don't know, he's just a brilliant sort of cosmic horror author, and your movie They Remain, if anyone doesn't know, is an adaptation of a Laird Barron short story. So, so obviously you're a big Laird Barron fan.
I am a big Laird Barron fan. Yeah, he's I don't even know what to say about it, except he's it's weird because we're friends now, so I'm like, it feels weird to like say things about him. But yeah, I've been a big fan of his for a long time. Adapted one of his stories into They Remain, which is a strange and difficult movie, but I'm also quite happy with how that one turned out. And we've been close ever since. And people haven't read him, go look up his works. His short story collections are, I think, some of the best. Like, they're just sort of perfectly calibrated things. And I highly recommend them. They're great.
Yeah, and you do a ton of stuff. I mean, you're doing television stuff, comics, and you were actually, I think you're sort of taking a hiatus now, but a podcaster. You used to do a
yes, I did. But your research is so thorough. Yes, I used to do a podcast with 2 friends of mine that was all about Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith, who was a friend of Lovecraft's as much as Lovecraft had friends. They were Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, who created Conan, and Clark Ashton Smith were all correspondents, like pen pal correspondents during the early days of Weird Tales, so like the 20s and 30s. And Clark Ashton Smith is the one of them who didn't make anything that went on to extreme fame, right? So he didn't make Conan, he didn't come up with Cthulhu, but he wrote a lot of great great short stories and weird science fiction stuff and horror. Have you read his stuff? Do you know his work at all?
Yeah, I read a collection of his short stories years ago. I think it was called The Return of the Sorcerer.
Yep. I know that one. It's good. They're all, well, some of his stuff is a little like pulpy and lame, but when he's on, I think he's, there's nobody better for.
Yeah, I think in his day, he was quite famous. He was known as like the best poet east of the Mississippi or something.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that's true. Yep. He was. Emperor of Dreams, I think, is the name of his like very, very famous poem. But famous, like that was famous in like weird poetry, like not weird fiction poetry, but like just poetry circles, which is just like he had this sort of double writer's life. And then lived, I mean, all those, Howard and Lovecraft died in the 30s, but Clark Ashton Smith lived on, and I think until about the 60s, but really stopped writing in the 40s and just sort of went on and had a weird bohemian lifestyle outside of San Francisco. But yeah, I don't do that podcast anymore. Unfortunately, it was a lot of fun. But it just, as things go, it died off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've got so much going on. I can definitely understand you have to, prioritize.
Yeah. At a certain point, Clark Ashton Smith has to just be like an interest, not an ongoing concern.
Yeah. Well, we should wrap this up. So, do you have any other projects or any final thoughts or anything to close this out here?
My only final thoughts are go and read all the people that we've mentioned. Read some M. John Harrison. Read some Clark Ashton Smith. Read some Laird Barron. Just it's just great. It's just good. It's just good stuff. Go check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we've been speaking with Philip Gelatt. And you should all go check out his sword and sorcery movie, The Spine of Night. So, Phil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was awesome.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Philip Gelatt for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks. or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.